What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news. And today, we have some breaking news. It is official. The Lions have named their defensive coordinator, and it's Kelvin Sheppard. So let's get it started. Welcome, everybody, to a video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, we're back with some Detroit Lions news, and it has officially happened. The guy whose name was initially tied with who's going to be the next defensive coordinator as the in-house option, it felt the most likely in-house, officially has been named as the defensive coordinator, and that is linebacker coach Kelvin Sheppard. Now, for the Lions, there really wasn't a lot of buzz in terms of names they were bringing in for potentially being the replacement at defensive coordinator. It was very quiet, and we know that there's a lot of buzz happening right now as different teams are scrambling, trying to figure out who's going to be their coordinators at this point in time, because a lot of teams are in a spot where, as I touched on yesterday, they're trying to get things back on track. Especially if you're looking for a defensive coordinator, a lot of teams are trying to get their defense jump started, or they're starting from scratch with a new head coach. So because of that, I think a lot of teams are kind of looking for that new vision. But the Lions are not in that boat. The Lions aren't looking, I think, for a new vision. They're looking to build on what they have built over the last 4 seasons. A defense that has continuously gotten better year after year, specifically last season in the back end. Their secondary has just continued to get better as they have continued to add to their personnel. Their second level, I think, played at the highest level that we have seen, and it has really the most optimism that I've ever felt about that linebacker room, and Kelvin Shepard is manning that room. And then, of course, in the run defense, while they took some steps back this past season, you could point a lot of that probably towards the injuries because the entire defensive line was decimated, but then also the fact that I thought schematically there were times that we weren't in a great position to play the run, so there was an aspect of that. However, today, the Lions decided to stick to the foundation and go with an in-house option in Kelvin Shepard, and personally, I really like this decision. Now, I was open to some of the other guys that we had discussed. I liked the idea of a guy like Jim Leonard, but I wasn't sure if it was going to fit in terms of how Dan Campbell saw things going defensively with how Jim Leonard did things stylistically up front, but specifically in the back end. Like Larry Foote, I thought was a very interesting option who had served as a co-defensive coordinator, and I thought that made sense. I always like taking guys from Tampa because defensively they do a fantastic job, and I thought there was definitely some similarities, though there was some differences in how they did things stylistically. There were things that I thought he could bring to the table that could potentially elevate what the Lions do defensively, specifically in their front seven and how sound they were in the back end. But for the Lions, they're coming off a fantastic season, and currently right now, after having hired C. Rodgers as their new defensive line coach, who did serve as co-defensive coordinator with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and will step in as the Lions defensive run game coordinator as well, which is the area that I think that they needed most improvement after last season. And that's not every game. It was just certain spots. I didn't think we were in a great position. As the NFL evolves and teams evolve and they find out what you're not great at, there's ways to attack that. So you have to find ways to adjust. And then if that's one schematic area, I think the Lions could improve. But outside of that, I love the way the team was trending. I thought Aaron Glenn continued to evolve as a defensive coordinator. Put together my wish list for each of the coordinator positions on who the Lions hire. And for me, one thing that I wanted to see as the continued nature of what the Lions had last season of being adaptable. Each game had a unique style of a game plan. How are we going to play things specifically in the coverage, in the back end, deal with what they like to do offensively. Maybe they're a vertical team like Green Bay was. They'd like to run 2 verts on one side, maybe double post on the backside. They like to take vertical shots. So how are you going to change what you do stylistically to deal with that? And even though sometimes it's not always perfect, you constantly saw throughout last season the Lions come in with different core game plans on how they wanted to play teams, specifically on base downs, on first downs, second downs, just a different stylistic approach, but always having the foundation of we like to play man coverage. We play that at a high level, usually top 10 in the NFL each season, but then we also like to blitz, and we blitz at usually a top 10 level in the NFL. We like to bring pressure. We like to bring extra guys, and on foundational downs like third down, the game plan was usually kind of stick to the script of we're probably going to play some sort of a cover 1 defense with blitzing attached, but not always. There was always wrinkles, even against Buffalo. Like, hey, we'll bring a 3-man rush. We'll drop out 2 rat backers that are on the defensive line to kind of settle in underneath, almost play as like spies. Lions always had little things like that last season where they always had a foundation in the core of who they were, a high single high coverage team with man coverage elements that were pretty heavily used, but then also having variety in what they did on coverage base downs in the back end, the type of zone coverage they would use. Maybe there's some matching principles that they would use for a specific game. Maybe there's some palms coverages that way they would utilize, like a team against Indianapolis, which we specifically spotlighted. So I wanted that to continue, and I think going in-house helps. And here's why I loved this was Kelvin Shepard. My biggest reason for loving the Kelvin Shepard idea was that he was here through all of that with Aaron Glenn. He was here the first season as an outside linebackers coach, and then he ultimately turned into our inside linebackers coach in 2022. But he was a part of the different game plans, the different schematic approaches year after year. He was also with Aaron Glenn as he continued to grow as a defensive coordinator, and he continued to add diversity to his schemes defensively. And while there was bumps along the road, just like it would be with a young player, there was a lot of improvements, and you could see the Lions just adjusting, finding new ways to approach things, and really being adaptable to the players that they had. That was another thing that I had on my coordinator wish list, was the adaptability that they had. They didn't need the Lions to go out and draft a specific guy to fit a specific position, because they ultimately wanted the best players that in their eyes were Lions. And because of that, they allowed themselves to be flexible defensively when they added those pieces, right? If he was a Lion, we can find a spot. The vision for Derek Barnes when they drafted him wasn't to play Sam backer, it was Mike. All of a sudden, a few years later, he's not doing that. If you Melifano, you think about some of the draft picks, drafted as a corner, then he's playing safety. Brian Branch, drafted as a nickel, plays nickel, next he's playing safety. They always had a vision of what a guy could become, but they also never pigeonholed themselves in that we have to draft a guy to fit this exact position. They would just adapt. When they first got here, it was different. With Trey Flowers and Romeo, it was a different front that they utilized. And I love that, because at that time, Kelvin Sheppard was working with the outside linebackers, which at that time, your Austin Bryants, Charles Harris's, who had the best season of his career. Want to resign that guy, the Lions ultimately did. He had a fantastic season that year. Austin Bryant played a majority of his snaps, and it was because there was a lot of Romeo Okwara. He didn't play as many snaps that season, but there was a lot of that where there was overlapping of the previous regime, and the Lions were adaptable. They said, this is what we have, this is how we're going to adapt to it. And I love the fact that Kelvin Sheppard was right in the mix of that, as seeing one outside linebacker room and how it was much different than what it was just a year later, where now all of a sudden James Houston is a guy that you're trying to get into the mix and you try to find his role. Is he off ball? No, let's move him, to let's put him on the ball. Let's play him in this, let's let him rush as a third down package piece. And then ultimately you get to like 2023 and we're thinking, okay, let's make him kind of the Sam backer. They ultimately just continue to adjust to the personnel that they had to try to find the best spots, and that continued to shift things how they played up front. You think of Levi, he's playing defensive end coming into the year because they thought it made the most sense for him. By the time at the end of the season, injuries pop up, he's playing defensive tackle again. So I love the fact that they were continuously willing to adapt to the personnel that they had, and as long as those guys were Lions at heart and they had those traits, whatever those traits may be, those traits that they could visualize, okay, what's the best spot for him, right? Does he have traits of a safety? Does he have traits of a on-ball defender, off-ball defender? And then ultimately we can adapt and try to find a way to make that fit as long as they are Lions. And I think that Kelvin Sheppard was in the midst of one of the positions that constantly had moving pieces, and that was linebacker. And if we're just looking at it in general, linebacker was such a developed position under Kelvin Sheppard. Like in his first season working with inside linebackers, you got Derek Barnes playing off-ball, and he's playing really well as a run defender. Coverage was a little bit shaky, so they kind of determined the role of, okay, he's really good in Tampa too. Let's let him chase guys up the seam. So we saw a lot of that with Derek Barnes. Alex Anzalone at that time, right, he's handling kind of the green dot. He's that piece of the defense. Malcolm Rodriguez, who the Lions weren't afraid to put on the field just because he was a late round pick and a rookie. They weren't afraid to put him out there. We've all seen the clips of Kelvin Sheppard calling out that linebacker room like, yo, he's young. This guy's a 6th round pick, but somebody's got to keep him off the field essentially. He's going to earn his snaps, and he did, and he played a ton that year, and he had a really good season for the Lions. They had their kind of, their sub-package backer, which they've always actually kind of had. At that time, it was Chris Board. Then you get to 2023, welcome in Jack Campbell. It's not the fastest start, and he's asked to play in a lot of different positions. He's got to play on the ball as well. It ultimately allowed a guy like Alex Anzalone to, I think, to get more to his comfort zone and kind of lean into what Alex does really well. Let him be the will backer at that time. Then Derek Barnes kind of settles into his role, and Melk Rodriguez settles into his roles. He's a really good zone depth piece. Maybe don't use him as much in man coverage. He's a special teams core piece for the Lions, and he's great against the run, and he's able to step into different spots. So when you lose guys during the playoffs like the Lions did, Melk Rodriguez was able to step in and play really well and play sound. Then they had Jalen Reese-Maybin as that sub-package backer, and I loved it with Jalen because same thing. Jalen we brought in, you're thinking, okay, special teams. When he first gets his look on defense, we see him in the red zone, and he looks awesome. He's helping us a ton of coverage, and it's like immediately the first game we had seen him, the response from me was, this guy has to continue to play defensively, and the Lions continue to allow him to play defensively. And then even into this season, the amount of new pieces that they had to constantly work in. I think Brad Holmes probably took note of that, where you have Quan Alexander, David Long, Ezekiel Turner. You're just going through different linebackers during the season. They constantly have to get these guys ready, find a spot they can play. I mean, you had guys like Ben Neiman playing on the line of scrimmage at one point last season, where it was like, this looks rough a little bit early, but by the time the game ended against Buffalo, it looked a lot better. Trevor Nowaski, he comes in, he fits into that role because the Lions need it. They have to have somebody that can play on the line. Trevor Nowaski handles that position. As the year goes on, he gets better and better. And I don't necessarily want to put that on Kelvin Sheppard. Maybe that's more of David Correo. But the point is, he's been right in the midst of all the movement that has mainly mainly taken place at linebacker. Coverage-wise, there's been differences schematically. We've done different things on base downs. We've had different approaches, maybe more cover 3 in the past based on the kind of stylistic players that we had with Amani Oruwariye and Jeff Okudah. And then you had Jerry Jacobs, and you got a little more of the man-centric, and you got a little bit more of the Jeff Okudah. Okay, let's play man, let's go press man. So they've always been adaptable to what they've had in terms of how we're going to play this scheme-wise. But I think the importance of the amount of movement that Kelvin Sheppard's had to deal with at that linebacker position and the constant development of Jack Campbell having his best season by far. He took massive strides this past season, looked super natural, and he really just held it down without Alex. I think he should have been an all-pro. He was that good. Run stop rate was top of the league. Like, the guy was fantastic this past year. He should have been an all-pro. But you also saw the limitations. It wasn't like you could just put him anywhere and he was elite, right? It was a little bit shaky when he was on the ball. A little bit shaky against Baltimore the first time around. It's like, okay, this is not something that he's naturally used to doing. But when he got back to his position, he has looked fantastic just being able to lean into that role. So we're seeing that when there's consistency and you're allowing Kelvin Sheppard to work with these guys at their role over and over, they just get better. And that's what we have seen so far. So I love what he's done with the linebacker room, but I really love the fact that he's been a part of what Aaron Glenn has been a part of the constant growth and the evolving of the defense, the trust that he has instilled in players to allow them to make decisions on the field, trusting them in spots where it's like, hey, we're going to allow you to play one-on-one because we believe in you. I thought sometimes to a fault Aaron Glenn would do that, but Kelvin Sheppard has been right there by the hip of Aaron Glenn through all of this. There's been changes. Aubrey Pleasant, there's been changes, right? You think of Mark DeLone was the first inside linebacker coach. And through all of this, Kelvin Sheppard has continued to stick around. He's moved different positions, but he's continued to work with the backers. And then also from a leadership perspective, from the outside looking in, from being able to get the attention of a room, right? To be able to draw attention of a room. I don't know that there's a better guy that we can look at and say, then Kelvin Sheppard, based on what we know, even just from the Hard Knocks clips alone. Things that I outlined is exactly what I was looking for in our next coordinator, right? I wanted to allow our players to have control on the field, right? Lead by the vets. Ultimately, it should be taken over by the veterans. And what happened was last season, it got taken over by the veterans, which was Kirby Joseph. He's a young player, but we think of him as a vet now because he took it over. He's the big communicator in the back end if you watch the Lions. I mean, he's constantly the guy getting players lined up, getting them where they need to be. And that's because of the freedom that they have allowed them to do that. And that's where you get guys like Alex, where it's like Aaron Glenn is like, I know exactly what he wants to get to because everybody understands the foundation of who they want to be, but then also they have that control on the field where things can go wrong like it did with Hutchinson, but it can also go right. And that's how a player is going to play at his best and play at his fastest, is when you allow them to have that control on the field and you trust players for that. And they're not going to have that kind of confidence if you micromanage everything on the field. And I think that that's what the Lions have done a really good job of. Yeah, you may get some hit and miss, but as long as you're willing to allow guys to earn roles in practice, which they have been, they've allowed guys to earn positions in practice, and you've allowed, regardless of draft position, and you've allowed them that freedom field, I think it opens up confidence, it opens up trust. Even when things go wrong, the Lions don't backtrack on the trust that they had in that player going into it. Again, I thought at times it was kind of a downside, but for the most part, in the overall grand scheme of things, it makes sense. And Dan Campbell laid out, he wanted to bring pressure, and he wanted to play man, and I think sticking in house was one of the easier ways to allow that to be the case. But I wouldn't overlook the fact that the Lions have brought in a guy like Casey Rogers and what he can help you with against a run and take on maybe a little bit more of that responsibility. That way it's not all on Kelvin Sheppard. He could continue to work with linebackers, which he's done a great job with. Different schematically of how they played a team like Washington and how they basically shut down their run game versus what we did. Like the differences in how they did things stylistically, I think a guy like that can really help with a guy like Kelvin Sheppard. And if the Lions are able to keep a guy like Deshae Townsend, which it seems like they're going to be able to, he interviewed for San Fran. San Fran has hired, a Robert Saleh back. If they can keep a guy like Townsend, who did an amazing job with the defensive backs last season and the growth that they had, but then also one of the best secondary units, if not the best secondary unit we've ever had, in the comfortability that they had within that scheme, I feel really comfortable about the guys that are also around Kelvin Sheppard. And I think we pointed this out before, but for me, again, I think it's so important that the emphasis on how do we play the run going forward. And I think, again, with the front seven has to be the focus because the amount of movement that has to take place. In the back end, I'm comfortable with Deshae Townsend. I'm comfortable with what we have in our players, and I'm confident that they'll be successful as we continue to go forward because that's really been the case as personnel has gotten better. They've just gotten better, and they've turned into one of the best secondary units. They're one of the best in every single man coverage metric across the board, depending on any man coverage type that you play. So I'm comfortable that's going to look really good, especially with the versatility and the safety play. But up front, to me, that has to be the emphasis. How do we get this run defense back to being top tier? And I just personally have a little bit more of a lean towards a guy that is the linebacker coach or maybe even the defensive line coach that's more involved in that and maybe helps that unit really get back to the top because I think that's where the Lions need to get to. I think that's the key for me here, is it doesn't feel like it's all on Kelvin. I feel good about Casey Rogers and his experience. I feel great about Deshae Townsend handling the defensive backs. I feel really good about the supporting cast that he has around him right now. And I think that's what's important with a guy like Kelvin Sheppard being put in this position. So we'll see how it ultimately plays out. I think a lot of things will carry over from what we saw with Aaron Glenn, and hopefully he continues to evolve as well as a defensive coordinator. I'm sure it might be a little bit bumpy early, but as a defensive coordinator, I want to continue to see things evolve and be willing to try different things, but also stay to the core of who the Lions are, because that has allowed them to continue to build a certain way, and ultimately it's gotten us to a place where the Lions play really fast in the red zone and on third downs, and they know what they want to get to. And even if the D offense knows this, a lot of times we still find success because we just played at a really high level. We are who we are. We played at a high level, and I think that's what's led to the Lions' success. And again, that whole man coverage idea is important, because the hardest thing for an offense to face is a team that's really good in man. It's one of the toughest spots to find answers, find efficiency offensively, is when you play a team that can play really high-level man coverage. So I love the fact the Lions are sticking to the foundation here. Happy for Kelvin Sheppard for earning this position, and I look forward to seeing what this is going to look like going forward. So again, I like some of those other out-of-house names, but a guy like Dennis Allen, for example, I really wasn't super on board with, because I didn't think we needed a guy that wanted to make it his defense. This is a collaborative effort, and I think the Lions have really good assistance alongside Kelvin as of now. I'm going to leave it there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Prod, for watching, and I'm out.